Hey, what's up, guys? This is Taco from DFSArmy.com, the lead NASCAR and PGA coach at DFS Army, and I'm here to share with you guys just a look back into last year to see how some of the numbers, which teams and stuff were affected the most by the changes last year. Of course, last year we saw the restrictor plate go away at Daytona and Talladega after the Daytona 500. And you saw the switch to the 550 horsepower package at some of the bigger tracks. So, the tracks 1 mile and shorter, they weren't really changed much at all, but they did add, things like a bigger spoiler that, kind of changed some things. So, just going to look at the numbers and see how much things changed from last year into this year. You can see we had an incredible year over here at DFSArmy.com. If you're serious about daily fantasy NASCAR, you've got to come join us. We were, it'll be hard. You'll be very hard pressed to find a site that had more success last year. We were winning the Octane and Xfinity and Truck Series just constantly. Just really good work by all of our members, taking down tons of huge wins. A really successful year for myself as well. Made a good amount of cash throughout the year, and we're just looking to keep it going. Continue to be one of the best in DFS NASCAR. And if you want to join us, DFSArmy.com. Use promo code TACO to get you a lifetime 20% off discount, of course. Let's dive right into this analysis here, starting out by looking at the team driver ratings by track, or just driver ratings for each player. Last year compared to this year at all the different track types, and it's sorted by team so we can get a sense of some trends here. We're starting off with just all the tracks, everything together, just overall how guys did. You'll see some of the bigger movers here, of course. William Byron, very, very young guy still, just turned 20, went from a 68 driver rating last year to 85 this year. Of course, Jimmy Johnson went down, not very much at all, but you should expect him to continue to underperform. William Byron did absorb his Jimmy Johnson's crew chief, so definitely look to see William Byron get more of the resources funneled his way. He won several poles this year, and it's just one of the more surprising, not really surprising because he's so good of a driver, but definitely one of the more apparent changes of the year, and you can see that with a huge increase there. There are some guys like Eric Jones who I expected to take a bit more of a step ahead, but really did not. It was actually a down year for Chase Elliott somehow, but you can see the biggest changes right here. Stewart Haas Racing, after their elite year last year where they crushed, they had unprecedented success. Those Fords were mighty fast. Kevin Harvick was still good, but he wasn't like best in all of NASCAR good. He was, took a seat right behind Kyle Busch, and I think Martin Truex might have edged him out there as well. Of course, we're not just going to look at driver ratings here. The next chart we'll see is the same sheet, but with Dominator points. You can see kind of where all those went to. Now, you'll notice some guys are missing. I wanted to specifically look at all the guys who did not change cars or teams from last year to this year. So, no Martin Truex, who went from Furniture Row Racing to JGR, the Joe Gibbs Racing Toyotas. And no Ryan Newman, who went to Roush from RCR, stuff like that. So, just looking at everyone whose ride stayed the same and seeing where all the changes came from. A decent year for JGR, but especially Denny Hamlin. Towards the end of the season there, he looked really good. Probably one of the best stretches of his entire career. A lot of people are expecting him to win the whole thing. Kyle Busch ended up winning the whole thing, but his driver rating actually went down from last year. Now you see a lot of the top tier guys had their driver rating go down, so it wasn't by that much compared to like a Harvick, but still, he had that 20 race stretch at the end of the season without a win. He started off the year red hot, was easily looking like the best driver, which he ended up being, but it kind of really tailed off at the second half of the year, going into the playoffs, where he had a lot of concerns about him. But of course, he was able to pick it up and put in a decent season. But Hamlin's the one we saw that progressed the most, at least. Just had some, a lot more success than the year before, which was honestly just a down year for him. But yeah, wish I could have seen more out of Eric Jones this year, but he's still got a long future ahead. Stuart Haas, of course, they all went down. Almirola, Boyer, these guys were in contention a whole lot more last year than this year. This is a pretty poor year for them. Kind of putting themselves out of the elite territory, which I consider to be like, 90 driver rating and above. We'll see some analysis in some of the upcoming tables where, we look by the studs and the scrubs, and the studs I have marked as 90 or above driver rating, and scrubs under 50. But Boyer and Almirola just not elite like they were last year. We saw, they were barely elite. They were just on an elite team last year. We saw Stuart Haas, at like Talladega last year, where they would just crush 1, 2, 3, 4 as an organization together. We did not see that this year at all. So looking to, Hendrick, of course, William Byron, of course, talked about him. Chase Elliott had sort of a down year. He seemed to only win on the track types that he's really good at. The road courses, he won a couple of those, but we'll look into stuff like his short and flat tracks where he took a huge nosedive. But Team Penske, about the same as last year. Last year they were a bit more spread, or a bit more even between Keselowski and Logano, and this year Logano was able to look a little better, especially on the the large tracks, of course, where he had the biggest gain of anybody. It seemed like he was really fast on the tracks like Michigan and Pocono, where it's just raw horsepower. And it's the intermediate tracks for Keselowski. Oh my gosh. He went from 104 driver rating to 85. That was very apparent, but he also had some incredible races. He put up the second most fantasy points of anybody at Martinsville when he led darn near the whole thing. So kind of looking similar to last year with Penske, but as you can see throughout here, some of the guys really changed up what kind of tracks they succeeded at. More of a down year for Larson. He started off the year pretty rough, but towards the playoff, he was actually, cooking a little bit there. So that's kind of something I expect to see out of him. Finally got his Chili Bowl win over Christopher Bell, who he gets to be racing constantly this year. So looking forward to that. And then, some of the scrubbier teams, I guess. Definitely an up year for Buescher. That was something we noticed big time, especially at the mile and a halfs. And then Ty Dillon, you can pretty much, group him with the RCR squad with his brother, Austin Dillon. Of course, Bubba Wallace, they're all kind of in that little family racing together. But, slightly better year for Ty Dillon, although his consistency in finishing on the lead lap that he just seriously overperformed with last year wasn't quite there. He had some just over finishes, I would say. He tended to survive and get some top 15s where he really shouldn't have this year, and that might lead to his higher driver rating. But still a fairly consistent guy. Didn't start the year the greatest, but ended up pretty darn good. And then Bubba Wallace, just not a very good year for him. Kind of stagnated, even got a little bit worse. Front Row Racing, we saw them add Matt Tifft, who is now gone, and of course David Reagan, he is now gone. He is retired. But we saw McDowell start the year off like a 5th at Daytona, and he's only good at the certain track types, of course. But looking at the intermediate tracks here now, let's just highlight that. Of course, William Byron, huge gains from him. Is able to lead laps. Unlike last year where he would get a random pole and he would immediately get ran around. He managed to put up some decent lead laps and stuff while he was on those poles. He never really just got bounced early, and even when he did, he was able to fight back and even get the lead at some of these places. Jimmy Johnson did a little better at the intermediate tracks too, and of course Alex Bowman, he got his win at Chicago, and looked seriously solid at the intermediate track, so that might be a place to really target him at. Of course, Kevin Harvick, he was the best at them last year by a long shot. Not so much this year. He was still the best at intermediate tracks, but didn't dominate quite as much. And even when he did dominate, a lot of those did not turn to wins. He got like 10 wins last year, and I think, 2 years ago, in 2018, he got 10 wins. I think he only had like 4 last year, and a lot of them came towards the end there. Went a pretty good while without a win, so of course down year for them. But oddly enough, Boyer and Almirola didn't really feel the hurt as much as Harvick, but maybe it's because Harvick was winning and leading way more laps last year. Of course, that's just where he shined way more than anybody else. But for JGR, Hamlin, of course, the intermediate tracks, it used to be he's seriously weak there. It looks like he swapped with Eric Jones, is where Jones did start the year off really hot at those 1.5 mile intermediate tracks, but second half of the year, not so much. And Kyle Busch, that's not really his best track type, but he was still able to hang. I think he led some decent laps, but definitely not the track type you're looking to target him at. We saw Larson also get worse, but Brad Keselowski, of course, seriously worse. Like, he had some real problems. Now, the thing about Team Penske this year is they all ended up doing a switcheroo with the crew chiefs and crews. So the only thing they kept was their spotters. So no more Paul Wolfe or Brad Keselowski. I think he's going to Ryan Blaney. So we'll have to see if that can help him out with these intermediate tracks, because this is the most common type of track on the NASCAR Cup Series circuit. So struggling there is not a very good sign. Austin Dillon did pretty good at those. Stenhouse also, we saw him get a lot of fast laps at these intermediate tracks, and we'll look at that with the next table we show. And of course, Chris Buescher, like I said, really, really shined at those 1.5 mile tracks, always finishing in like the top 16. For a guy that usually starts in the mid 20s or so, always was a very good value on DraftKings. Looking at the short and flat tracks, so your tracks like Martinsville and I almost said Iowa, but that is in Xfinity, of course. But tracks like Loudon, Phoenix, and all them. Hamlin, of course, looked really, really good. Second in the entire field. I don't know about Truex. I think Truex probably be right there as well, but just a huge difference from last year. Kyle Busch, this is his best track type. He's always the best at these, but still the best, but not quite as good as he was last year. At least not quite as dominant. Maybe with a little bit of that love going to Hamlin here. And then, Eric Jones, he did improve at least at this track type. Probably, because he's got these guys to freaking learn from and Truex. So, again, I really expect more out of Eric Jones moving forwards. But as far as Stuart Haas goes, Clint Bowyer, this is his best track type. He's, the short and flat tracks. We do see a little bit more driver skill expressed than just raw like horsepower, like you would see large and flat tracks where he freaking sucked at. But I was able to just kind of do what he always does at his preferred track type. Almirola, not nearly as good as last year. He had him and Chase Elliott fell off majorly. This is a big disappointment here. Chase was really, really good at these last year and just came up short time and time again. Of course, a lot of his struggles were crashing in DNFs, but did not do well at the short tracks. Also, we saw Bowman get significantly worse. Like, such a difference between him at intermediate tracks and at short and flat tracks. It's insane. Blaney, very good on them. Keselowski also. A lot of that's going to come from Martinsville, where he just crushed. I think he got like a 150 driver rating there. But Blaney, surprising increase from him. Logano about the same. Depends on whether or not you count his Richmond wins, where he was cheating, had his win taken away. And Kyle Larson, another place where he kind of struggled. Not as much as at intermediate tracks, but still. Buescher also just, he improved in most of these track types. Just a really good year for him. And this was the one place where Bubba Wallace was actually a little better at that, along with the short, steep, and large flat tracks. Speaking of the devil here, short and steep tracks, So your Bristols, your Darlingtons, your Dovers. Your JGR did better this year, of course, with Stuart Haas Racing falling miserably. Harvick was just dominating pretty much every track type last year except the road courses, and I would say even the super speedways. He was pretty darn good at those too, but at the short and steep tracks last year, just a lot of trouble for him. It was even worse than Boyer, of course, who's a much better short track racer. Kind of just does his thing, like with the short and flat tracks, but just huge drop off from last year. Almirola, massive drop off. 59 driver rating. That is almost scrub level. You cannot really be playing him at these short and steep tracks for whatever reason until we see any signs of form from him. More disappointment and mediocrity from Chase, but William Byron. This is a very good track type from him. We did see that trend in Xfinity and continues on here. He's getting better every year. I'm telling you, he's going to be really good here in the future. Joey Logano, another track type that he really struggled at. Actually, like if you look, that's the one track type that he just struggled at majorly this year. After being one of the best last season, so not really too sure what's up with that. Keselowski about the same, Blaney about the same, Larson about the same. Paul Menard got a little bit better, but not too much. Ty Dillon, notably better. This is definitely one of his preferred track types. Is kind of a bounce back from last year where he kind of underperformed at them. And of course McDowell, he's also very good at these. This is the one where he jumped up the most of anything. Large and flat tracks, so this is like Pocono, Michigan, Auto Club, Clint Boyer, huge drop off there. Just horsepower matters a lot on these things. I don't know why Harvick and Almirola were able to gain, but just a place you avoided Boyer at pretty much all costs. Just driving wide open out there. And then Joey Logano, of course, he crushed these last year. He absolutely crushed these. He had a couple races at like Michigan where his car looked like it was just cheating. It was so much faster than everyone else's, and he seems to absorb the powers of his teammates there. It does help that spotter TJ Majors great out in the when the tracks are wide open. Chris Buescher, another place where he really excelled is he just got more horsepower in his car. Dylan, Bubba Wallace also saw some improvements. Kyle Busch, not quite as good as those as he was last year. He did defend his title at Auto Club, I do believe, but again, another place where in the later half of the year he was not looking all that hot. Hamlin, another spot where he got better. Road courses, of course, we're going to jump right to Chase Elliott, who's continues to be the best. I would say if Truex was on this graph, he would also be a big jump because it's pretty much just Chase Elliott and Truex at the road courses. Those are the only guys really doing much. Kyle Busch, rough go at it for him compared to last year. As for Hamlin, another spot where he improved, and William Byron looked really awesome at these. Another place where I think he can get a win at. Blaney, significant improvements from Blaney. Not something I expected out of him. I expect him to struggle. His teammates kind of always have at road courses, but him and Logano seriously improved this year. I think Logano just had an awful season last year at the road courses, but there aren't as many road courses. We only go to about 3 if you count the Roval. So, sample size pretty small with this entire one. And then, of course, super speedways, kind of random, Kyle Busch, 97. As we're Joey Logano 102. You're not going to see that on many other track types, I guess, except large and flat. But Penske always does really well in these, but Keselowski really, he improved just from an odd off season last year, where he's usually, it's either him or Logano usually winning at Talladega, but just back to doing what he usually does. But Logano, of course, with TJ Majors. I think that's what makes him so good at super speedways. That's where just having a great spotter really shines. Let me mute my phone here. Not too much to say about that. Bubba Wallace seriously fell off after some seriously good finishes last year. An 80 driver rating. It's better than guys like Chase Elliott and stuff. But Of course, remember he was on the pole at the Daytona 500 and crashed immediately. So super speedways only go to 4 of them, just like roads. Also, sample size kind of lower there. Now looking at Dominator points, this will tell you a lot. We're really only going to focus on the top teams here because those are the ones putting up all the Dominator points. Denny Hamlin, of course, an up year for him. We saw him, before he was someone that always qualifies in the top 10, but struggled, only getting 4% of the Dominator points last year. Now, he only got about half as much as his teammate Kyle Busch, but Kyle Busch got most of these in the first half of the year, and Hamlin was not dominating anything early on, but ended up becoming a consistent dominator come like the playoffs. Eric Jones still not doing much here. Harvick was able to put up more Dominator points than you would expect given how much he seemed to have fallen off, but he had some races like I think Atlanta and stuff where he would lead a ton of laps, especially at the 1.5s, where he puts in work. At the large flat tracks too, led almost 20% of the laps there, but of course nothing compared to last season where he was just unfair a lot of the time, led way more laps than anyone else. Clint Bowyer and Almirola pretty much irrelevant, kind of there with Eric Jones. Jimmy Johnson also, we only saw him, at the short and steep tracks and the intermediate tracks. It's probably Darlington here. I'm pretty sure that was Darlington. Just a track he's always kind of crushed, or Dover too. And then at the intermediate tracks, there were some tracks like Chicago where just Hendrick was just fast. We saw across the board everybody dominated significantly more than last year, where they all had 2% or less of the lead laps and fast laps at intermediate tracks. So it was nice to see him there, but that's really the only place where they seem to excel outside of course Elliott and Byron at those road courses. Now looking at Penske, Brad K led less laps, only led 4% of the laps. That's pretty darn low for him. Just not a good track type for him last year, and we saw that. Logano, he was good at the intermediate tracks, but he would always be like second or third. He wasn't leading a ton of laps. He was getting some fast laps and stuff, but it's always been a struggle for him. He's not been one to put up the fast laps, and he needs to go out there and get those lead laps to really put up the Dominator points for fantasy scoring, but still not able to be elite at those like he is at some other track types. Larson, he got a little bit worse than last year. And then Stenhouse was someone that did improve. We noticed that over and over. He finished way better at intermediate tracks than he had in previous seasons. Just going through short and flat tracks real quick. Of course, that's Kyle Busch's jam, and he crushed them. And then Denny Hamlin, almost doubled his Dominator points at short and flat tracks. We'll have to see if that continues on to next year. Harvick and Bowyer fell off in those as they weren't really, they weren't going to be really dominating much. Honestly, 2.3% is kind of surprising from Almirola. I think those are mostly just fast laps. I don't remember him really leading a bunch at any short and flat track unless something's escaped my memory here. Hendrick, just kind of the same old here. Willie B is the only one that improved. We'll see that with a lot of them. Then Penske, Keselowski, of course, that's just Martinsville right there. So, kind of the same old last year, minus that random Martinsville race for Keselowski. The short and steep tracks. Denny Hamlin, of course, another one. Huge drop off for Harvick, who led, the most short and steep lead laps last year and didn't really do much this year. Under 6%, less than guys like Hamlin and Chase Elliott. Chase, that was one of the good spots for him at those track types. And then Larson, this is usually his much preferred track type here. Was still decent, with the short and steep ones, like Bristol especially, but not nearly as good as he was last year. Large and flat tracks, Kyle Busch, really good at those, of course. Kevin Harvick, just not. He led 27% of the laps here last year. It just shows you how much freaking horsepower is in those Fords last year, those SHR Fords with that package from the year before, but did change quite a bit. Joey Logano, again, this is where he improved the most. He was really fast at a lot of these, so we'll have to see that continues on to next year. And then Kyle Larson, now he has a history here. Back in 2017, he was winning all these large and flat tracks. Last year, terrible at them. I'm sorry, right there. That's Larson. 1.6% of the Dominator points. That's almost nothing, but was able to kind of get back to his ways there. At the road course, of course, Chase Elliott, 32% of the Dominator points there. That is absurd. It was pretty much just him and Truex again, just crushing it. And we saw some drop-offs from Kyle Larson, who I think he had some poles last year, but really not that great at the road courses. And then Kyle Busch, it was real pedestrian year from him at the road courses. Super Speedway, this is just kind of whatever, because fast laps go around, to whomever is kind of at the rear of the field here. But of course, Joey Logano, he kind of does this thing. Sort of like we saw from Blaney last year, but not much you can really read into that with the Super Speedway stuff. So this next tab here, this is 2019 versus 2018. Some of these will kind of surprise you here. Just going to start off with drivers per race, just slightly less drivers than last year. Saw some more 37 and 38 car fields, but it wasn't too much different than last year. Percentage of laps finished. This will show just, like caution rate and stuff pretty much. Just how many, if someone's scheduled to race 200 laps and they do 199, then they'd have like 99% of their laps finished, sort of like that. They finished more laps than last year. Now, there's this thinking that goes, that this year was a lot more green flags and stuff, but really just, look at the data. It's not really that much of a change from last year. Only 1% more of the laps finished. Only 0.3 more in your average green flag run. Now, a lot of these stats, and I'm pretty sure, not the overall ones like this, but a lot of these stats I did adjust to take out the road courses and the super speedways. But these here, just the overall numbers here. This is my favorite one right here. There was the exact same number of cautions last year as in 2018. That is a fact. And it seems crazy because, at the 1.5 mile tracks, it seems like there were no cautions. We had multiple 0 caution races with only the 2 cautions or yellow flags for the stage ending. But, we saw a whole bunch of crashes at some places like, the last Talladega race with the rain delay. And we just had some wild races, and somehow they ended up with the exact same amount of cautions as the year before. These stats right here, this is where we see, a lot of the changes. This is where we see them the most at. Green flag passes, 10,000 more green flag passes this last year, and 5,000 more quality passes, or 23% more quality passes. We were seeing guys, at some of the tracks just getting passed for the lead, more than in years before. And that's kind of what some of the changes to the intermediate tracks were kind of meant for, even though it seemed like the leader couldn't be passed on a lot of them. Some of the changes really did result in way more passes. Now, a lot of these are going to come from the super speedways. This might be more indicative of a change, with getting rid of the restrictor plate and all, but, those leads were constantly being passed around and stuff, but still, really fascinating to see the huge difference there. So average speed at the short tracks, same package as last year, but we ended up going a few miles an hour faster there. Now this is surprising here because they, with all the changes to the 1.5 and larger tracks, you'd figure that the speed would be a little different, but they went like a mile an hour faster last year. Some things like colder tracks or the weather and whatnot might have played factor into that, but I was actually surprised to see that they went faster at the 1.5s this year. And then at super speedways, of course, another difference we're really looking for. With the restrictor plates last year, they were going 147 about. They're going 141 this year with the tapered spacer, so a little bit slower at the super speedways. Now you've got the average stud dominator points percentage. So this is the percentage of dominator points that went to these studs. And we saw that numbers decrease significantly last year. So this was a trend that we've noticed. 67% of the dominator points went to the studs in 2018. This year they're spread out a lot more to like the mid-pack sort of guys. So they're able to claim a larger chunk of it than we're used to seeing. This is average percentage of laps completed by the studs. So we saw them finish just about 1% more of their laps on average. So a little bit more consistent from the best of the best cars, but not too much. Their fantasy points went up on DraftKings, but they stayed the same on FanDuel. But yeah, on average, the studs got about 5% more fantasy points than in the year prior. Looking at the scrubs again, guys 50 driver rating or lower on average throughout the year. So pretty much the back end sort of guys. They completed 2% more, almost 3% more of their laps. So they're a little bit safer to roster this last year. They averaged about a point more on DraftKings than they did in the year before, but around the same on FanDuel, but still averaged a little bit more, 3% more than they did the year before. So kind of an up year for the scrubs in a way. Looking at the average pole sitter dominator point percentage, it really did not change much from last year at all. Just slightly less dominator points went to the pole sitter, as they were a little bit more likely to get past, as we saw with some of these changes here. And then in fantasy points, this is an interesting one. The pole sitter averaged 11% less fantasy points than they did last year. Last year, the pole sitter averaged 50 fantasy points. I'm not sure if this has to do with how many times Byron won the pole, and of course he's not gonna like crush as much as like Kyle Busch or Truex or whatever, but still, that is a pretty significant difference there. And on FanDuel, the pole sitters, they scored about the same still. So that's an interesting thing to note between the two sites. Pole sitters are still going to be a little more generous to your FanDuel scores because fast laps aren't considered. So really it looks like the difference is really fast laps. The pole sitters seem to get less fast laps than in years before. Over here we've got the percentage of the dominator points given to guys on the pole. Oh, no, this is the exact same thing as this thing when I pulled it over, so I just skip that, never mind. Looking at the top 5 starting positions, the dominator points, they got a little bit more last year, so kind of a similar trend as we see to the pole sitters, just a little bit more spread out there. But the top 5 starting positions, they scored 4% more on DraftKings and 3% more on FanDuel. And then we're looking at the guys starting in the bottom 10 of the field, guys starting 30th or worse. Just 0.7 more points on DraftKings, so 3% more there, and 2% more on FanDuel. No really big changes there. And it completed about 1.5% more of their laps on average. Now, here we're looking at the studs who ended up starting 20th or worse. We saw a few more of those than in the previous year. Not too many more. Most of these would be like Toyotas. For some reason, JGR like to have guys like Truex and Kyle Busch starting, qualifying like 20th, 23rd, or whatever, because they just didn't really go too hard in the qualifying trim. This is where we really see that trend. We saw guys like Kyle Busch and Truex starting 25th, several times towards the end of the year. But not as much as last year, actually. Shoot, that's what I'm looking at here. 34 times we had some studs starting 25th or worse, compared to only 25 this year. And again, most of those are probably the Toyotas. But and then as far as starting 30th or worse, that's where you're talking like impound, getting sent to the back and whatnot. It had a few less instances of that than we did last year, with the studs at least. Lead lap finish percentage. So this is the percentage of guys just finishing on the lead lap. Only a 1%, 2% increase in that, so not too much at all. Now these stats right here, this is the percentage of guys who finish at least 99% of their laps, 95%. Um, not too much. Not too much change from last year. So these stats are going to be kind of similar to these sort of stats over here. Laps finished. But yeah, this is just this will show you what percentage of the field. Only 1% of the field last year had finished less than 25% of their laps. So pretty significant little increase there in the number of like catastrophic DNFs there. About a 1% decrease, in that. So it's only like a 1% difference, right? But when you're talking about, here you had like 4% of the field that wouldn't even finish half the race, and last year it was only like 3% of the field. That's actually a pretty big difference there. So less of these catastrophic sort of DNFs, and guys just finishing some more laps in general. So that's the comparison of last year to this year. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to show you guys here, just the top scores of the year. Of course, number one, you got Martin Truex Jr. set the all-time DraftKings record, leading 464 laps at Martinsville. And then you got Brad Keselowski, who started the year with an insane 446 laps led, but didn't have nearly as many fast laps as Truex did when he just absolutely crushed that track. So going to Martinsville next year, if you don't have the Dominator, you don't have any money, period. Like that that's clear as day right there. That is one change that we've noticed big time. I don't know if it was just a coincidence that happened or not, but it really does stick out as they got 50 more fantasy points than anyone. And what are the next two right there? Oh, Phoenix. We saw people lead a ton of laps at Phoenix, but it's the fast laps. Got tons and tons of fast laps going to these Dominators at Phoenix. Going to have to think about that moving forward. Dover, Richmond. Oops. Truex at Dover. Truex at Charlotte, looking like it's 2016 again. Again, it was the fast laps. It wasn't him leading like 400 laps like we saw at Phoenix, the Coke 600 the one time. No, it was the fast laps. I mean, that's what really leads to a lot of these big DraftKings scores. You can see when you're getting mostly the fast laps and not the lead laps, that's when the fantasy or the FanDuel points start dropping off a little bit compared to where Logano, you see the FanDuel points up, but again, that's at a 500 lap track, of course, with the 0.1 fantasy points per just lap finished. That's really goes to show you the difference in the scoring of the sites. I'm sure if you sort it by FanDuel, you'll see. Ah, shoot. I gotta undo this first because that's how Google Sheets is like. But yeah, if you look at FanDuel, that's pretty much just gonna correlate with this as far as the big scores go. But when DraftKings is in play, I think I like their scoring system a little better. Incorporates these fast laps. Of course, it makes it a little frustrating at some places like a Daytona or whatever, where the fast laps are going to be mixed around randomly. But yeah, these were just the top dogs of the year, the biggest, baddest performances. Had some darn near perfect driver ratings. Had a perfect driver rating with Kevin Harvick at Indy, but with only 160 laps on there. Still utter domination. Probably gained the most fantasy points of the field, like percentage-wise. If we're looking at that, he'd probably be in the top there. But, with not as many laps, you're not going to get as many DraftKings points. But speaking of Indy, we do have the Indianapolis Road Course next year. It's something we're going to check out for sure. I'll say it right, I promise. Matt DiBenedetto was just there with his new team, Team Penske. Of course, he took over Paul Menard's spot as he retired. But, that's something that is going to be really awesome to look forward to next year. And if you need some daily fantasy advice, you need some good projections, you need a great optimizer for all the series, not just the Cup Series. We're talking, Truck Series and Xfinity Series, even with the short time in between qualifying and the race. That's where we get a lot of our edge from. Always get those up there right as soon as qualifying ends. We're just going to continue to crush. You can come crush with us. Check us out at dfsarmy.com. Use promo code TACO to get you that lifetime 20% off discount. This has been, looking to last year, and hopefully the 2020 season is even better. And I'll see you guys then.